Om Sarashivasamarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Om. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to the many students attending our classes virtually online. We continue in this wonderful chapter of Uddhava Gita. Just to set the context for today's class, Sri Krishna had taught earlier in this chapter how to use meditation for the sake of overcoming the rajas and tamas in our minds so that we can make some progress on the path of spiritual growth. The fact is that the problem, locus of the problem is in your mind, ignorance, and the locus of the solution is also in your mind, spiritual wisdom. Excuse me. Meaning, if your mind's not in very good shape, it's not going to work. This won't sink in, so to speak. It won't lead to a transformation of the way you think and feel in your day-to-day life. And that's obviously the goal. The goal is to become free from suffering. And unless our minds undergo a fairly radical change, there's no possibility to be free from suffering. So for this reason, overcoming rajas and tamas in an ongoing spiritual practice, Sri Krishna focused on meditation. It's crucial. At the end of that explanation, he ended by saying, do you know, this meditative practice has been taught by my disciples. Disciples? Sanaka, Sanandana, Sanatana, and Sujata, the four Manasaputra, the four mental, mind-born sons of Lord Brahma. Now, it sounds a little funny when Sri Krishna says, they're my disciples. That leads Uddhava to wonder, how can they be your disciples? They lived eons ago. So how is it that they are your disciples? That might remind you of how chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita begins. My memory is terrible, by the way. Imam vivasvate yogam proktavanaham avyayam. So he begins chapter 4 with those words saying that this teaching I taught to Vivaswan, God in the form of the Son. So proktavanaham, I said, I taught him so long ago. Vivaswan manave prahuhu. He taught it to, then the Son taught it to Manu. Manu taught it to Ikshwaku. And he gives a lineage. This is how chapter 4 begins, leading Arjuna to have exactly the same confusion as does Uddhava here. How is it? Sri Krishna is present here in front of me in this form. How was this teaching? How is it that these four mind-born sons of Lord Brahma were his direct disciples? It doesn't make any sense. And to answer that, Sri Krishna begins to narrate a story. In the story, Sanandana, the four mind-born sons of Brahma, they approach their father and ask their father for spiritual guidance, and particularly spiritual guidance on how to overcome rajas and tamas. And then that is the context of the story that Lord Krishna narrates. So what we're seeing today is a narration of Sri Krishna describing this event when the four Manasaputras of Brahma approached him for instruction on how to overcome rajas and tamas. So with that, we can pick up the thread. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Evam Prishto Mahadevaha, Evam Prishto Mahadevaha, Swayambhur Bhuta Bhavanaha, Swayambhur Bhuta Bhavanaha, Dhyayamana Prashna Bijam, Dhyayamana Prashna Bijam, Nabhyapadyata Karma Dhihi, Nabhyapadyata Karma Dhihi. So, Sri Bhagavan, Sri Krishna, continues to narrate the story to Uddhava. And he tells Uddhava that Mahadevaha, which here means Lord Brahma. We're not talking about Lord Shiva here. So Mahadeva, just take it literally, the great God. So in this case, Lord Brahma, who was evam prishtaha, having been asked by his four sons about how to overcome rajas and tamas. So Lord Brahma, who is Swayambhuhu, self-existent, the first deity, the one who is Bhuta Bhavanaha, the one who is the creator of all else that exists. So having been asked by his four sons how to overcome rajas and tamas, Dhyayamanaha, he thought about it. He thought it over, but in the last line, na abhyapadyata, he was not able to get the prashna bijam, literally the seed of the question, the answer to the question. So he was asked by his four sons, hey, they won't speak American English, but if they did, hey, Dad. No Pitaji in this country. Only, hey, Dad. So he was asked how to overcome rajas and tamas. He thought about it, and he didn't get an answer. By the way, if you don't get an answer, what should you do? And some modern-day dads make the mistake of inventing answers for their children, which is not a very good strategy, because your children can go on the internet and find out that dad is wrong. So don't do it. If you don't know, you say, I don't know. And there's a pride issue, especially with some men who don't like to admit they don't know. Get over it. Come on. Really speaking, that kind of male pride is such an obstacle in life. It's just an encumbrance. It doesn't help anything, and it ends up causing lots of problems. If you don't know, you say, I don't know. Best thing in the world. So Brahma said, I don't get it. I don't know. But he's got an excuse. Dad may or may not have an excuse. Brahmaji has an excuse. Karma dhihi. his dhihi, his mind, is engaged in karma, in his work of creating the universe. He's a little preoccupied with his profession. His profession in this case being creating the world. So what happened next? And this is again all narrated by Sri Krishna to Uddhava. Samama chintayat devaha, samama chintayat devaha, prashna paratitirshaya, prashna paratitirshaya, tasyaham hamsarupena, tasyaham hamsarupena, sakhasamagamam tada, sakhasamagamam tata. Saha, and at the end of the line, devaha. That deva, that form of God, Brahmaji, what did he do? Mam achintayat. He thought of me. Interesting. Brahmaji doesn't have an answer for his children, so in his mind is, what would Sri Krishna say? By the way, if you have any Christian friends, one of their favorite sayings is, what would Jesus do? We have no idea what Jesus would do. Here, Brahma asks himself a similar question, though. What would Sri Krishna respond to this? Now, somebody may get fussy here. Say, wait a minute. At the time of Brahmaji and his 4 sons, Sri Krishna didn't exist as an avatara yet. Well, honestly, if that's your concern, you're missing the boat, as we say in American English, because this is a story meant to teach us not about historical events, it's meant to teach us about spiritual truths. So if your focus is on how could that be, there are ways of explaining it. We could easily say, Brahmaji thought of Lord Krishna as Narayana, who is coexistent with Brahma, as Lord Vishnu. But I've observed, on my YouTube channel, I get so many comments, and I read them all. I don't answer them, but I read them all. This kind of question is so common. People asking, wait a minute, Krishna didn't even exist then. How could Brahma think about Lord Krishna? Those questions show that you're not paying attention to the right thing. This is a story meant to teach you spiritual principles. Why are you, to use American English, why are you so hung up on these historical details? And elsewhere, you've heard me say quite extensively, the Puranas, including the Bhagavata Purana, they are not history books. Full stop. They are not history books. These are stories meant to teach us spiritual principles. They need not be historically accurate to teach us spiritual principles. I've made the comment before that you've read books of fiction from which you learn so much about life. So this does not have to be historically accurate. This, meaning the Bhagavata Purana, remember Uddhava Gita is a small section of the Bhagavata Purana in 11th book. It need not be historically accurate, but it can still teach us a lot. But if you're focused on historical inaccuracies, you're not going to get the spiritual teachings. Okay, enough said. So, Saha Devaha, that God, that Lord Brahma, Mama Chintayat, he thought of me. Why? Prashnapara Titirshaya, because he was desirous of figuring out an answer to the prashna, to the question. He didn't get an answer in his mind. When he thought about it, being so engaged in his ongoing work, he wasn't able to figure out how to respond to his sons about how to overcome raga, dvesha. So he thought, well, maybe Sri Krishna would be able to answer that. And then, things get interesting here. Tasya aham agamam tada, then, at the end of the verse. Tada, then, aham, I. Who is narrating the story? Sri Krishna. So Sri Krishna says, aham agamam, I came, I arrived. Tasya sakasham, right in front of them. I came before them, hamsa rupena, in the form of a hamsa, a swan. And here the Hamsa Gita begins. Sri Krishna now appears in the form of a swan. And again, if you're struggling with the historicity of this, what to say? Your attention is focused on the wrong thing. Okay, so Sri Krishna says, I appeared in the form of a swan. Now, before we continue, some of you know the symbolism of swan. Swan, in fact, it's very prominent on the logo of the Ramakrishna mission. Very beautiful swan present there. And that swan, the conventional way of explaining the symbolism of the swan goes to another mythological story. I'm not sure if it's in the Bhagavata Purana or where it is. Another mythological story of a swan whose milk was poured into the lake, and this swan was somehow able to drink the milk, separating it from the water of the lake. Don't ask me how. The swan had that ability to drink only the milk, and that's held to be an example of extreme discernment, viveka, the ability of a wise person to know the difference between one thing and another, between satyam and mithya, reality and that which is apparent. That's the most commonly given metaphor, example, I should say. But there's another explanation that personally I find much more meaningful. Some of you know that Paramahamsa is a title for a sannyasi. It's a sannyasa where you don't have a danda and all of this stuff. It's said to be the highest kind of sannyasa. Anyway, that's the tradition into which I've been ordained, initiated. So why is a sannyasi called a... You translate this stuff into English, it sounds ridiculous. Supreme swan. How is that? It's not translatable. Don't even try. But here, the symbolism, I think, is better understood, not through that drinking milk metaphor story, but through another metaphor that observes when the swan, and I think this is true of most birds, most water birds, they swim on the water, their skin remains perfectly dry. Yeah. If their skin got wet, don't you think they would become uncomfortable or get ill from spending all that time in the water? Of course. So their feathers are of such a nature that their skin remains perfectly dry in spite of being in contact with that water almost continually, right? Swans live in the water. When they're not flying or maybe walking around on the ground, they're mostly in that water. That metaphor represents something quite different, and that is a sannyasi, or we'll say a wise person, is one who is able to be in the world but absolutely untouched by it. This is a metaphor. Like the swan is able to be in the water and be absolutely untouched by the water, its skin, in the same way a sannyasi or a wise person is able to be in the world but remain absolutely untouched by the world. It then represents that kind of detachment, which is a different metaphor. And honestly, I find that metaphor in many cases much more meaningful. Certainly when you talk about a sannyasi being a paramahamsa, it's with that meaning in mind, being able, that sannyasi is one who can be in the world without being affected by the world. Continuing. Drishtva mam tahupavrajya, drishtva mam tahupavrajya, kritva padabhivandanam, kritva padabhivandanam, brahmanamagrata kritva, brahmanamagrata kritva, prapachu ko bhavanati, prapachu ko bhavanati. That ta in the middle of the first line is te, they. They being whom? Brahmaji with his 4 sons. They, mam drishtva, having seen me, seeing me as a swan, as that hamsa, seeing me as a swan, upavrajya, they approached me in the form of a swan, and kritva, after doing para abhivandanam, worship of the feet. It's interesting. There's a swan, and here's Brahmaji worshiping the feet of a swan. Brahmaji knows it's not a swan. Brahmaji knows this is an incarnation of Lord Vishnu, and Brahmaji sees Lord Krishna in that swan. Therefore, pada abhivandanam kritva, having worshipped the feet of the swan, brahmanam agrataha kritva, and agrataha kritva, putting in front. Who is in front? Brahmanam. Brahmaji is put in front. So you can imagine there's the swan, there's Brahmaji, and then the sons are behind Brahmaji. And in that situation, prapachuhu, they asked, Brahmaji and his 4 sons, they asked, ko bhavan iti, who are you? So maybe it's the sons who ask. Brahmaji, I think I have to retract what I just said. It's not Brahmaji and the sons who asked, but Brahmaji knew this is Lord Krishna. Brahmaji's sons didn't know. They saw his father worship the feet of the swan. They're wondering what's going on. So the sons of Brahmaji asked, Ko Bhavan, who are you? And Krishna continues his narration. Ityaham munibhih prishtas, ityaham munibhih prishtas, tattva jignasubhistada, tattva jignasubhistada, tadavochamaham tebhyas, tadvochamaham tebhyas, taduddhava nibodhame, taduddhava nibodhame. Iti, thus, this is Sri Krishna speaking, thus, aham, I, yeah, any problem? So, aham, I, Sri Krishna says, munibihi prishtaha, being asked by these munis, the 4 mind-born sons of Brahmaji, being asked by them of who am I, and those 4 sons of Brahma were tattva jignasubihi. They wanted to know the tattva, the truth. What is the truth of this swan? It obviously can't be an ordinary swan if our father is going to do some kind of puja to its feet. So they wanted to know the truth of that swan tada. Then, aham avochama. Aham, Sri Krishna, avochama, he said, yet he said this, tebyaha, unto them. So Sri Krishna now addresses is going to address the four mind-born sons of Brahma, and then he refers to Uddhava, tad Uddhava, O Uddhava, tad nabodha me, listen to what I told them. So now we're going to see what is Sri Krishna's response to the question of the four sons, who are you? And before we see the answer, there are two kinds of answers. My guru was really, really good at this. Somebody would come with a first satsang, and he was very accessible for informal satsang, informal questions. And sometimes he would get questions where usually a guy, sorry to say, but usually it's a male who goes on and on and on. Again, this pride thing, they want to show off how much they know, which makes them look really stupid in front of a great saint like Puja Swami Tadatmananda. Anyway, you get the point. I mean, not drag it out. So somebody will ask a question which is somehow off target. You can imagine somebody who asks a question, they have some ulterior motive or some wrong thinking. Anyway, the question ends up being a little bit somehow misdirected. What was amazing was Puja Swami Dayananda's ability to discern the manner in which the question was misdirected, and then to use this as his own words. He would say, I always answer the questioner, not the question. Those are his exact words. I always answer the questioner, not the question, because a question can be misdirected. So he wants to respond to the questioner. And that's exactly what happens in Sri Krishna, in the Hamsa. And Sri Krishna as a Hamsa responds to the four sons of Brahma in exactly this way. So he's asked, Ko Bhavan, who are you? And the direct answer would be, I'm Sri Krishna, in the form of a Hamsa. But that would be to answer the question and not the questioner, which is what Sri Krishna does here. Let's see what he told to those four sons. He said, Vastuno yadanana tvam, Vastuno yadanana tvam, Atmana prashna hidrishaha, Atmana prashna hidrishaha, Katam ghate tavo prashna vipra, Katam ghate tavo vipra, Vakturva mekaha shrayaha, Vakturva mekaha shrayaha. Start in the second line. Prashnaha idrishaha. Idrishaha, this kind of question. Prashna, this kind of question. Second line, vo is vaha, of yours. This kind of question of yours, vipraha, O vipra, O literally brahmanas, O sons of Brahma. He says, Katam gateta, how can your question be reasonable? So we can see already he's addressing the possible misdirection. So Sri Krishna says, in what way is your question reasonable? And he goes on to explain in the last line, he says, Vaktuhu me, for me, the one who is speaking, kaha ashrayaha. What perspective? Here, ashraya means perspective. Kaha ashrayaha. I'll paraphrase, from what perspective shall I answer? You asked, who am I? And his response was, from what perspective shall I answer? The commentator goes on to make it very clear what's going on here. The commentator actually makes an interesting, he says, this is prashna kandana mishena. Actually, I had to look up mishena. It's not a very common word. In this context, it's to use something as a pretext. So he's using this criticism of the question as a pretext to teach them something. So instead of answering the question, he is criticizing the question. By the way, that's happened to you, right? You ask a question, and they say, what do you mean by that? And you know you've asked a wrong question. Well, that's sort of what's happening here, except Sri Krishna is not upset. Like the person who says, what do you mean by that, is obviously upset. Here, Sri Krishna is going to use this as a pretext, as an opportunity to teach some very profound teachings to these sons of Brahmaji, because Sri Krishna knows that's what they really want. They don't care about ko bhavan, who are you? It's not really what's of greatest interest to them. Remember, they had asked their father about how to overcome rajas and tamas. So they're not that interested in a swan. They're more interested in spiritual growth. That's the questioner. So Sri Krishna ignores the question and goes for the questioner. And when he says, kaha ashrayaha, from what standpoint? The commentator makes it clear there are two possible standpoints. One is from the standpoint of Atma, and the other is from the standpoint of the swan, body, mind, senses. These are two valid perspectives. So they ask, Ko Bhavan, who are you? Are they asking about Satchidananda Atma, which is the essence of Sri Krishna in the form of the swan? Or are they asking about Sri Krishna in the form of a swan, which is a body, mind, sense complex? And Sri Krishna says, from which perspective should I answer you? Are you asking about Atma? Or are you asking about the swan when you say, who am I? And he starts with Atma. That's in the very first line, the response. He says, Vastunaha Atmanaha. You have to connect those two words. If you're asking about Atma, the truth of Sri Krishna speaking, the truth of who I am is Atma. Vastunaha, that's the reality of who is Sri Krishna in the form of a swan. Yadi, if you're asking about Atma, the reality of who I am, then there's no answer. Because Atma, kaha bhavan, who are you, is a question asking for what makes you distinct. What makes you distinctly you? What makes Atma distinct? Atma has a nanatvam. Atma is not many. There's not one Atma that's any different from any other Atma. There is only one Atma. You know this very well. You've heard it so many times. There is only one Atma, and that Atma has no jati, no family that it was born in, has no name, has no qualities. So it's like, I'm looking for a metaphor. Here's a metaphor. This is 1 cubic foot of space, right? 1 cubic foot of space, and I ask you, what kind of space is it? Space has no, you can't, how heavy is it? What color is it? What is its name? These silly questions. Space has no such qualities whatsoever, and that further, the space is one. Even though I'm talking about this 1 cubic foot, everything is in space, space being all-pervasive, infinite, so it's an invalid question. This is what Sri Krishna wants to point out. If your question is with regard to Atma, and you're asking Ko Bhavan, who are you? Who is Atma? Atma is not a who. That's the problem. Atma is not a who. Now, in the next verse, we go on to what if the question, the other option. So are you asking about Atma, or are you asking about this swan in front of you? Sri Krishna in the form of a swan. So he addresses the second option in the next verse. Panchatmakeshu bhuteshu, panchatmakeshu bhuteshu, samaneshu cha vastutaha, samaneshu cha vastutaha, ko bhavanati vah prashno, ko bhavanati vah prashno, vacharambho hyanartakaha, vacharambho hyanartat. So he says, vastutaha. Now we're looking at the second option. He's already said, if you're asking about Atma, that's, what do you say? Sabbakvase. A little bit of Hindi, I know. So it's all ridiculous stuff. Your question is ridiculous if you're asking about Atma. But now suppose you're asking about Sri Krishna in the form of a swan. Sri Krishna says, second line, vastutaha, in reality, panchatmakeshu bhuteshu, with regard to this body, this swan body, which is made of bhutas, elements, panchatmaka, 5 kinds of elements, with regard to this body, made of 5 kinds of elements, samaneshu, like anything else. Everything else in the world is made of the same 5 elements. So the swan, Sri Krishna as a swan, points to its body. I don't know, how does a swan, I don't know. The wing, if they can point to the body or not, I have no idea. Anyway, he indicates, why think of such weird things? How does a swan point? Figure it out. Anyway. So he says that this swan body of mine is made of the same 5 elements as everything else. There's nothing distinctive about this body. Strike 2. So already he said, if you're asking about Atma, Bhagavas, and if you're asking about this swan, similarly, there's no distinction between the 5 elements in the body of a swan and the 5 elements of which the entire cosmos is made. There's no individuality. Again, in fact, Sri Krishna just makes that point here very clearly. He says, Ko bhavanati vaha prashnaha, vaha prashnaha, your question. What question? Ko bhavan, who are you? Your question is, he indeed anartakaha, meaningless. That's the Sanskrit translation of Bhagavas. That's what it means. At least in my Shabdakosha, that's how I get the meaning in my dictionary. So what you've said is vak arambha, it's mere words. It is anartaka, it is meaningless, because this swan body is made of the same 5 elements that everything else is made. There's no individuality here to be seen. So, Sri Krishna, as the commentator said, Prashna Kandana Mishena. The Sri Krishna has blasted their question on these two bases is said your question is invalid. If you're asking about Atma, it's meaningless. If you're asking about a swan, it's equally meaningless. So far, it's all, the commentator says, prashna khandana. He's just tearing apart the question, showing the invalidity of the question. Then what is the point that Sri Krishna wants to teach? So remember, the prashna khandana, the dismissal of the validity of the question, is for a purpose. What is the purpose? The purpose is to teach something to these four sons of Brahma. What is it he wants to teach is found in the next verse. Manasa vachasa drishtya Manasa vachasa drishtya Grihyate nyayarapi indriyaihi Grihyate nyayarindriyaihi Ahameva namatonyata Ahameva namatonyata Iti buddhyadvamanjasa Iti buddhyadvamanjana. Start in the third line. Ahameva, go up a line, grihyate. I alone am grasped. We need to introduce this. So Sri Krishna is answering this question from a standpoint in which both of those options are resolved. So both of those questions, who are you? If you're asking about Atma, the question is invalid. If you're asking about the swan, your question is invalid. So Sri Krishna now is adopting a position that resolves the issue of the defective nature of these two questions. He resolves it at a very high level, and in order to understand this, we have to understand the principle Sri Krishna is teaching. It's a principle known as Sarvatma Bhava. Bhava, a state or condition of being Sarva Atma, the Atma of all, the truth of all, the essence of all. The essence of all means that because of which everything exists. Now, generally in Advaita Vedanta, we say that because of which everything exists, the underlying reality, we call adhishtanam, that underlying reality, we give it the name Brahma. Brahman, the absolute reality. But Sri Krishna is responding from even a higher level than that, and that is the ultimate teaching of Vedanta. Try this, see if this works for you. The ultimate teaching of Vedanta is not merely to know that your true nature is Satchidananda Atma, unborn, uncreated, limitless, vast consciousness that's not affected by anything whatsoever. That is not the ultimate teaching of Vedanta, nor is the ultimate teaching of Vedanta that Brahman is the underlying reality because of which everything exists. Neither one of these are the ultimate truth of Vedanta. What is the ultimate truth of Vedanta? Tat tvam asi. Tat, that ultimate reality because of which everything exists, tvam asi, is identical to Satchidananda Atma, the limitless, unborn consciousness, which is your essential nature. That is the ultimate teaching. It includes both of those other perspectives. That ultimate teaching conveyed in Tattvamasi includes that you are a conscious being independent of your body and mind, unborn, uncreated, boundaryless, limitless, and utterly unaffected by all worldly problems. That's one. The other teaching, there is an underlying reality because of which everything exists. That underlying reality is Brahman. This teaching includes both. Tattvamasi includes both, merges both of these teachings into one, which is expressed Tattvamasi, which is also alternately expressed as Sarvatma Bhava, this condition of being the Atma of all. Atma is Brahman. Atma, the truth of you, is Brahman, the truth of the universe. This is the highest teaching, Sarvatma Bhava. And the way it resolves the questions is, if you're asking about Atma, you're asking about, how to express it? In the second half, it says, if you're asking about the swan is made of 5 elements. Watch this now. The swan is made of 5 elements, but those 5 elements exist because of Brahman. Brahman, which is identical to Atma. And that's where the question is resolved. So the 5 elements of which the swan is made, those elements exist because of Brahman. That Brahman is identical to Atma. That is Sarvatma Bhava. There is only one reality. That one reality is present right now in 2 manners. That one reality is present as the consciousness by which you know what's happening right now. And that one reality is present as the underlying reality because of which everything else exists, including your own body and mind. That one same reality is responsible for your consciousness, and it's responsible for everything else. Every time I use that expression, few of you remember my joke. In 1981, hearing Puja Swamiji for the first time, he hadn't been in this country much. He had a very strong Tamilian accent, and he was talking about a topic like this, and he kept talking about everything else, and I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. What is everything else? Anyway, this is the idea. Consciousness and everything else. One and the same reality. That is Sarvatma Bhava, and that is a perspective from which Sri Krishna answers this question. Now that we understand what is Sarvatma Bhava, now this verse will make sense. Again, start in the 3rd line. Aham eva. I alone, grihyate, am grasped. Am grasped how? Manasa, 1st line. With your mind, I alone am grasped. Vachasa, with your words, I alone am grasped. Drishtya, with your power of sight, I alone am grasped. Anyaihi api indriyaihi, and with any other of your senses, I alone am grasped, because it's the only thing there is. That one reality. There's nothing else. This is Advaita Vedanta. There is only that one reality. Sri Krishna is identified here with that reality. He says, I'll paraphrase, I alone exist as the one you conceive of with your mind, as the one you describe with words, as the one you see with your eyes, as the one you perceive with any other sense. I alone am that existent reality. Aham eva. Na mattaha anyat. There is nothing anyat, nothing separate, mattaha, from me. In fact, better than separate, there is nothing other than me. I am that one reality because of which you exist as a conscious being, because of which the entire cosmos exists. I am that one reality. Iti, thus, buddhyatvam. Buddhyatvam, you should understand. Thus, you should understand anjasa correctly. This is such a profound teaching. He really went to the highest level to teach these rishis. Interesting. As a teacher, I like to psychoanalyze teachers. Why is that teacher saying this? Why is the other teacher saying that? What is their orientation? What is their psychology? What's going on? So my psychoanalysis of Lord Krishna is like this. The ones asking him this question are not ordinary people. These are, in fact, he himself addresses them as munis, great sages. They may, in the literature, they're always presented as being very young, and we associate being young as not being very wise. Nothing could be further from the truth here. These are the sons of Brahmaji. They're exceedingly wise. So Sri Krishna, when he is asked, Ko Bhavan, who are you? Sri Krishna wants to give an answer. Again, doesn't answer the question. In fact, he blasts the question. Instead of answering the question, he gives this really, really profound teaching. I am the one reality because of which all pervasive consciousness exists, the one Atma, and I am the same one reality because of which the world of names and forms exists through so many elements. I am that one reality. So an exceedingly lofty perspective here, but then remember the orientation remember the issue of the four sons of Brahma. They wanted to understand not the one reality, they really wanted to understand how to overcome rajas and tamas, right? And that's what we'll see in the next class. So having answered the question at a very high level, now in our next class, Sri Krishna begins to address that question, how to overcome rajas and tamas so that you can go on a spiritual journey in which you finally gain this sarvatma bhava. You realize this sarvatma bhava. So we'll continue next week. Quick announcements. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our Upadesha Sahasri, our Vedanta class, and I want to make a special point right now, and that is that text is composed of chapters. Each chapter is completely independent. We're starting a new chapter tomorrow, which means if you'd like to join or rejoin that class, tomorrow is the time to do so. At the beginning of a chapter, within the chapter, there's a lot of continuity. A little hard to come in the middle of a chapter, but to come at the beginning of a chapter, you'll have no trouble at all. So if you'd like to join or rejoin the class, come and join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Immediately after class at 11 will be satsanga. Come with your questions. And then tomorrow at 4 p.m. is our Samashraya support group. It's a support group for caregivers of those. I'm sorry? Oh, it's today. Thank you. Not Sunday. Thank you. The support group is today, Saturday, at 4 p.m. today. It'll meet right here in this hall. And as I said, it's a support group for caregivers of those struggling with any form of mental illness. If that support group will be helpful to you, please come. and join us. And we'll conclude with our prayers. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shranvan Utabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.